Sony had grown to be a dominant force in the world of electronics in the second half of the 20th century. Just in the realm of television sets, its Trinitron technology set standards in both quality and technological advancement when it was first released in 1968. Meanwhile, in neighboring Korea, Samsung's electronics branch was still producing fairly low-quality, black and white televisions into the 1970s. However, if we fast forward a few decades, the situation had turned, and it was now Samsung that was on the cutting edge, with Sony struggling to keep up. How did this shift occur? How did Samsung, a company that was a complete afterthought in the international market, become one of the world's most valuable brands? How did it surpass Sony, which had been ahead of it technologically by leaps and bounds, all in the span of about a decade? What were the factors behind the Japanese brand's decline, and how did the Korean Samsung begin to dominate their overlapping businesses on almost all fronts? In this video, I want to examine the battle between Sony and Samsung and get to the bottom of what exactly happened. Sony was on top of the world under the guidance of its co-founder, Akio Morita. Surfing a wave of expansion in the economy, Sony closed out the 80s with its acquisition of Columbia Pictures in 1989. The acquisition was a disaster during the early years, causing Sony to have to write down $3.5 billion in losses by 1994 and restructure its entertainment business. The 1980s hadn't all been beneficial to Sony's fate. The 1985 Plaza Accord caused the yen to increase significantly versus the dollar, putting Japan at an export disadvantage. Then the electronics business growth further slowed from their historical 20% increase down to just 4% in 1991, as the US had gone into a recession. By 1993, Sony was in trouble. The business was suffering, debt had ballooned, and the company couldn't borrow more capital because their credit rating had been downgraded. As John Nathan writes in his book on Sony, plans called for capital spending to be reduced by $500 million in the following year. The investment in research and development, Sony's lifeline, was to be curtailed, and a halt was called to factory building. An expensive high-definition television plant was to be retrofitted for conventional TV. In 1993, Akio Morita suffered a stroke. This was another major blow for the company. Morita was the one man that really had enough clout within Sony to hold together increasingly separate business segments and have executives follow his orders. Morita had already been focusing less time running the day-to-day Sony business, and much of that responsibility fell to Norio Oga. Oga, while being a brilliant man and integral to the history of Sony, was perhaps being too hands-off with the various businesses under the Sony umbrella at a time where things were beginning to get choppy for the brand. Once Morita was forced to resign due to his declining health, Oga took over completely. The problem was that he was also very near retirement age and would be forced to name a successor by 1995. His choice to succeed him as president came out of left field for most, even within the company. Nobuyuki Ide wasn't an engineer like the co-founders of Sony or even Oga himself. Instead, he had been heading the marketing department. Ide took the reins of the company and began to make moves based on turning things around at Sony and what he thought the future of the business might be. Various restructuring would go on in the company during Ide's tenure, and even after he resigned in 2005. It started to almost look performative, as there didn't seem to be a clear-cut goal in mind during all of this shuffling. Ide's vision, however, was what he termed the age of networks. Sony would have their electronics business, their music and gaming content, and a focus on network services to tie everything together with the internet and broadcasting. Ide thought that the home computer would be the centerpiece of the age of networks, and Sony's Veo brand would link their audio-visual media with various distribution networks. While President Ide was trying to institute his vision for Sony, the still chairman, Norio Oga, didn't seem to have much faith in his successor, and it certainly didn't help the dissent or willingness to listen to the new boss from other segments of the company. The cracks are already beginning to show in interviews conducted with the men in 1998 for John Nathan's book on Sony, with Oga constantly reminding Ide of his own successes and revealing how he was trying to make it easy for Ide to not screw up completely. Oga's quoted in an interview, "I shouldn't say this, but I arranged things so that he would be profitable automatically, with no effort on his part, the minute the yen weakened against the dollar, and that began to happen when he took over." End quote. For Ide's part, he's clearly frustrated during this time frame with having Oga's presence constantly looming over him. As he said about Oga, he doesn't communicate, he announces. He confronts me once a week, every time we meet, with the same challenge. I created the CD, the mini disc, the this and that. What have you done? What are you going to do? And he's speaking as a rival, as though we were competing. The politics and the unwieldy size of Sony started to cause the various business groups to act more like independent entities. Sharing and effective communication was evaporating, which isn't great when you're trying to build a strategy based on networks. In one famous example, Sony produced 2 separate digital music players in 1999. It was said that Ide had ordered the VO division to create one, because the audio division wasn't going to. But the audio division did indeed later come up with their own model. Neither was a very good product, despite beating the iPod to the market by 2 years, and had little success. Instead of embracing the MP3 file format, Sony was still trying to push the one that they had developed for their minidisc product. Add to that, even if there had been one successful digital music player, it would have been difficult for Sony to develop something along the lines of iTunes. It would have forced Sony to potentially cannibalize their own profits and arrange licenses with their competitors in the music publishing world. Samsung, meanwhile, supplied memory for Apple's iPod, almost inadvertently helping to further beat Sony in a field they naturally should have dominated, while also learning know-how that would later help Samsung in their mobile phone development. The cuts in the R&D budget, trying to milk older products for all they were worth, and the silo effect that was happening between different business segments all culminated to hamper the creation of the type of innovative products that Sony was known for. Ide was still pushing the network strategy without much success to show for it. His calls for creating newer products to replace the still profitable legacy businesses fell on deaf ears. Ide knew the days of the Walkman and other gadgets were over, but segment managers still saw them as profitable and not yet needing to be replaced. Outside of the PlayStation, the cupboard was getting pretty bare by the early 2000s, and Sony's reliance on in-house development of technology and standards wasn't keeping pace with other companies in the market. Even the VAIO line of computers was getting stale and lacking the innovation necessary to make it the centerpiece of any network strategy. Interestingly, Sony actually took a more vertically integrated approach with PlayStation versus the rest of its product lines. This is similar to what Samsung had been doing with its electronics, to close the gap with its rival. The PlayStation semiconductor chips were produced in-house, allowing for the capture of more value. They also invested heavily into this business, even while cuts were going on elsewhere in the company. As Professor Si-Jin Chang writes in his book, Sony vs. Samsung, Sony's obsession with its own standards have biased it against other firms' technologies or standards when these were incompatible with its own. This is the NIH, not invented here, syndrome. The legacy products, such as the analog Trinitron televisions, were now becoming a drag on the company as the shift to digital rapidly increased in speed. Sony had factories that had a longer scheduled lifespan than the new technology shift would allow. Cutting these factories loose would mean further short-term losses and potential write-downs. This is during the same time frame that the company chose not to invest heavily in PDP and LCD-based digital TVs. Again, Chang notes, Sony's decision not to invest in PDPs or LCDs cost it dearly. Demand for these products exploded in 2002 as several firms introduced PDP and LCD TVs and priced them aggressively. It got to the point where Sony actually had to launch a joint venture with Samsung in 2003 to produce LCD televisions and play catch-up. Finally, Sony's marketing and brand value had always been tied to its innovative and cool products. Well, what happens when that pipeline dries up? The marketing during this time didn't seem to have a clear strategy, and the company wasn't allocating enough resources to hold the line in important markets. As a result, the brand image declined quite a bit, along with market share. Samsung in the 1970s was not a technological powerhouse or a very innovative company, at least in the electronics realm that we're focusing on. In fact, they were pretty much taking components produced by Japanese manufacturers and assembling them into finished goods. They tried to design and manufacture their own components, but the quality was quite poor. The Korean semiconductor acquisition in 1974 put the company on the path to becoming what they are today. However, it was a long road to get Samsung to any real level of competency. They didn't really enter the space until 1983, and as is noted in the book Samsung 3.0, the market's response was to declare the end of Samsung. But Samsung's focus on the memory side of the business allowed them to grab first place in that field by 1993. Korean Semiconductor had already been way behind the rest of the competition in the space. Plus, the company was nearly bankrupt when it was acquired by Samsung. Due to this fact, there needed to be a push for expertise and an investment in newer facilities. The experts Samsung pursued were from Japan and began to help the firm with technological transfer. As one former Samsung executive is quoted, "Traveling to Japan to meet semiconductor experts almost every week, I tried to learn from them anything that might be of use. At the time, I would often secretly bring in Japanese experts on Saturday and have them teach my engineers overnight before sending them back on Sunday." They also sent their engineers to Micron Technology in the United States for a technology transfer of 56K DRAM design. The Samsung engineers were only allowed a strict amount of information and the basic training on how to produce the technology. The rest they would have to figure out for themselves. Samsung's first major push in the semiconductor space was in the development of 256K DRAM. Obviously, their in-house expertise wasn't up to par to compete in this space, and so they brought in engineering talent by offering 4 to 5 times the salary of what the company president was making. This rapid growth in investment and a focus on being the best in the world in this space allowed Samsung to quickly close the gap between them and their competitors in the market. This did put the company at risk because semiconductors required large amounts of capital, and any failure could put all of the Samsung business groups into troublesome territory. However, the upside to the gamble was that the company could catch up to its competition and eventually take over the market, since the industry as a whole wasn't investing like Samsung when DRAM sales were slumping. The 256K DRAM chip was a massively successful product, as noted in the Sony versus Samsung book. Quote, "In 1988, Samsung's profits were large enough to offset all its cumulative losses. In fact, Samsung's investment in manufacturing facilities in 1987 contributed to its success in the semiconductor boom, which continued into the early 1990s. This was a part of Samsung's parallel development strategy. They would begin to develop the next generation of DRAM while simultaneously mass-producing the current standard chip. Speed and being first to market is a common theme with Samsung Electronics, as the company, when involved in commodity products, wants to be first to capture the most value before competition destroys the profit margins. Thus, they stack cash for further research and development to beat everyone to the punch in the future, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of success. This differed greatly from Sony's focus on creating the latest must-have or unique products, which, while being high reward, also had a high failure rate. Samsung was going to build its foundation on capturing an early mover cost advantage and going after products with a clear future trajectory. I would be remiss in discussing Samsung business strategy and its ascension to the top of the electronics space if I also didn't mention Lee Kun Hee, the founder's son who took control of the company in 1987. The family involvement in the business and the guiding hand and authority of Chairman Lee is something pretty unique to Samsung when compared to other companies like the modern Sony. Outside of Samsung Electronics, the structure of all its business groups is often Byzantine and baffling and self-serving to the controlling family. Plus, it's changed fairly often over the decades. Ignoring all of that and the legal troubles, it can't really be understated just how influential Chairman Lee was in dragging Samsung from complete obscurity into a global leadership role. In the book, The Samsung Way, the authors identify 3 early movements in his tenure that set Samsung on the path to dominance. First was the 1987 declaration of the Second Foundation. Second was capturing the #1 spot in DRAM in 1992. Third was Lee's new management initiative in 1993. Lee first moved to create the so-called Second Foundation of the company. He had the goal of transforming Samsung into a world-class business, with semiconductors being the spark. As the Second Foundation is described in the Samsung Way, quote, Samsung integrated its electronics, related businesses, expanded its heavy industry and chemical businesses, strengthened its financial and service arms, and accelerated its entry overseas. Chairman Lee would talk about how he felt an overwhelming crisis about the company and it needed to adapt. During the second foundation, he said, "Now is a time to do better or die. Our products are still far from catching up with those from advanced countries. We must get rid of a second-place mindset. If we are not the world's number one, we will not survive." In short, catching up was the hallmark of the second foundation. Be fast, develop skills, capture value and market share. By 1993, the new management initiative began to shift the focus to developing the best products possible, still maintaining the speed, but also becoming true innovators instead of just fast followers. This was also a time where the company began to spin off non-performing or other businesses that could not be integrated into the new vision. The segments that were performing well would now also fund the expansion into other core competencies for Samsung Electronics. The new management initiative was not always a smooth transition for the first 4 years into the 1997 Asian financial crisis. Chairman Lee had to battle bureaucracy, still all too often poor manufacturing quality, and a lack of engineering talent in some sectors. The chairman often preached the importance of quality, even going so far as to ritualistically destroy shoddy electronics at a company gathering in the mid-90s, as described in the Samsung way. At the center of the gathering were cordless telephones, car phones, and fax machines valued at about $20 million. Employees then smashed the phones and set them on fire. Samsung had made strides in sectors like the mobile phone market, but still couldn't capture the innovative streak necessary for success. They even began to bring in engineers from the former Soviet Union to aid in this pursuit. The new management initiative really wouldn't fully click until the 1997 crisis broke out. This would push Samsung to the brink, and the company needed to undergo massive restructuring if it was going to make it through. The crisis turned out to be exactly what the company needed to streamline and bring Chairman Lee's vision into focus. On the reaction to the crisis, the Samsung Way authors write, "Businesses that were in the red or only barely profitable were dumped, reducing the number of Samsung's affiliates from 59 to 40 by the end of 1998. Less viable affiliates in divisions like construction machinery and forklifts were sold. Even profitable assets were not spared if they were found to add little long-term value. The company would lose $360 million in 1998, but the quick restructuring moves allowed Samsung to right the ship and reposition itself in a much healthier way financially. It did involve letting go 50,000 employees and getting rid of even more businesses, including an ill-conceived automotive branch. The promise of the 1990s hadn't exactly come to pass as the Asian financial crisis ripped through. Business Week during this time still described Samsung as a manufacturer of commodity chips, and not anything remotely having to do with innovation. Now that we've thoroughly set the stage for each company through the tail end of the 1990s, along with the challenges they faced, let's get to the competition between Sony and Samsung, and just how Samsung so thoroughly dominated their shared industries in less than a decade. Keep in mind, Samsung and Sony weren't competing with one another in every industry. They did have certain supply relationships with one another, such as Samsung's parts for the PlayStation console. In fact, Sony being stretched thin into other industries probably contributed greatly to just how fast Samsung moved into the leadership position where they did overlap. In the 2008 book, Sony versus Samsung, it lays out that the pair, quote, compete in the realms of TVs, DVDs, audio, camcorders, digital cameras, and mobile phones. Just so we're clear as to what was at stake. I think that the best place to start exploring the competition is the shift from analog technology to digital, which really highlights the speed and vertical integration advantage that Samsung had versus the plodding and cultural resistance that Sony was showing during this time period. The analog era relied on specialized knowledge of circuits, where Sony's expertise and multi-decade head start was insurmountable. In the digital world, that lead pretty much evaporated, and a company like Samsung could outcompete its entrenched opponent. It really didn't have to be this way at all. In fact, when I read Sony founder Akio Morita's book Made in Japan, he is talking about the company's exciting research and development into digital technologies way back in 1986, including televisions, where Samsung would really strike a blow in the 1997 to 2002 period. Everything was there for Sony to capitalize on and continue its run at the top of these industries. But the Japanese firms, including Sony, were hesitating in heavy investment, particularly in upgrading LCD substrates for the newer generation of the technology. Chairman Lee, on the other hand, made it a priority and Samsung grabbed the lead. The Samsung Way describes just how seriously Samsung took its opportunities, even during the depths of the crisis. Quote, "The company spent $50 billion, won over 10 years on product development that involved 600 researchers. As a result, Samsung developed 1,600 core technologies and had applied for patents on 1,500 of them by early 1998. Samsung would do the same in LCD panels, lithium-ion batteries, mobile phones, and semiconductors, including its continued excellence in memory. Meanwhile, Sony had been doing cost-cutting measures to help goose earnings and hold on to analog TV sales for as long as possible, which would come back to bite them. Professor Chang writes in his book, "The commoditization, shortened product lifecycle, horizontal specialization, and modularization that have long characterized the PC industry are now more apparent in the digital TV industry. The competitive advantage for Sony was gone. While the changes played right into the hands of Samsung, Sony still had the content of games, film, and music for its network strategy, but much of the hardware to run it all on was getting picked apart. Samsung was stepping on the gas, investing heavily its growing cash flows into the next generation of products, particularly AMOLEDs, along with its LCD development. The amount that was being risked put the company into a perpetual crisis mode, where they absolutely had to deliver. There was also a push to further develop its value chain, IT infrastructure, and marketing. Samsung had concentrations of factories among its different businesses, which meant that if they needed to develop a new mobile device, they could do so in a matter of months, sourcing parts from the camera division or memory or even display panels. By the mid-2000s, they could get this done literally twice as fast as their competitors. The synergy between products meant advances in one area, made the company more efficient everywhere else in the business, which spelled rapid growth for the brand. Besides their in-house development, Samsung wasn't afraid to tap into its vast supplier network to get the parts they needed. This was something that Sony had hesitated to do, wanting instead to rely on their own parts, which might not be available or were slow to get done. The internal business structuring and development of products at Samsung had taken great strides over the years. That's all well and good, but Sony still had the name recognition that Samsung lacked. In the developed world, Samsung was either unknown or associated with its past of poor quality products. Their moderate success in the mobile phone business, up to this point, really helped to shift the narrative somewhat. Marketing the new Samsung became a focus of the company. They did things like target the developing world, starting in 1995 with massive campaigns to start to create a global footprint. They spent $400 million on branding in 10 key markets. Sony during the early 2000s didn't have much of a clear advertising strategy and were still just coasting off of their reputation. This was especially the case in emerging markets. Samsung launched its Digital campaign in 1999 under the guidance of its global chief marketing officer, Eric Kim. This campaign marked the introduction of Samsung's new mission, quote, "to integrate digital home, mobile, and personal multimedia on a global scale." This was also around the time that the head-to-head competition between these two companies started to be acknowledged. In Jeffrey Kane's book, Samsung Rising, he notes on Samsung's marketing in this era, quote, "But there was a deeper purpose to branding campaigns like this. Behind the scenes, Samsung executives were benchmarking themselves against Sony, but no one wanted to say it publicly and risk angering their Japanese rival, which happened to be a massive buyer of Samsung parts for its PlayStation and Walkman CD player. The competition had heated up, but Sony actually wasn't completely beaten back in every industry. In 2005, they were still #1 in digital camcorders and cameras. In LCD TVs, there was a three-way tie for second between Sony, Samsung, and Philips. However, Samsung did take the pole position in 2006 with the release of its best-selling Bordeaux TV. This product launch really marked a further turning point in the new management initiative, going beyond just higher quality. Samsung was now focusing on beauty and technical innovation. Samsung had been sending its engineers around the world for artistic inspiration, bringing in designers and further focusing on software development, all of which would go a long way in the subsequent mobile phone space. It's interesting that in Professor Chang's book, Sony vs. Samsung, released in 2008, Samsung and Sony Ericsson were tied for third in mobile phones. Fast forward to today, and Samsung owns around 19% of the market. while Sony sold just 2.9 million phones in the entirety of 2020. By the middle of the decade, the shift had pretty much already occurred. Samsung was no longer an insignificant firm, it had become world-class. Its operating profits were now consistently higher than Sony's, and the next four biggest Japanese electronics companies combined. The Samsung way credits a lot of success to Samsung's careful merger of both Japanese and American business techniques. They took the disciplined manufacturing techniques and emphasis on quality from Japanese firms, while blending that with American-style branding, technology, risk-taking, and talent recruitment. With massive investment to achieve economies of scale in targeted businesses, anticipating and reacting to market changes, and gradually evolving the strengths of the company, Samsung completely outflanked Sony in the competition during this time period. All of this success would set Samsung up to be able to take on Apple head-to-head in the next decade. A nice twist of fate, since it was their supplying of flash memory for the iPod that really allowed Samsung to take the US semiconductor market, which helped fund their smartphone venture. As for Sony, I think I'll sum up this period of time in this video with an excerpt from Samsung Rising. Once the world's admired product, Sony Walkmans had disappeared from the marketplace with the rise of the iPhone. The Sony Ericsson phones had failed to catch on. Sony Trinitron televisions had been passed by in the marketplace. Once the world's most innovative consumer company, Sony, the Japanese miracle, had been reduced to a whimper.